Hi, everybody. I'm Mrs. Sarah Ryan, and welcome to another edition of Psychology from My Kitchen. Today, we are launching into Unit 6 of AP Psychology, which is learning. One of my favorite units. We are learning about learning, which I know sounds kind of funny. So let's break that down a little bit. First of all, when we say that we're learning about learning, we're not talking about memorizing like different kinds of formulas or the periodic table of elements or even what like our definitions in psychology are. Those all deal with cognition and they're in our next unit. Learning is really referring to learned behavior. And so in this unit, we're looking at what are the specific ways that human beings are most likely going to learn the various behaviors that they're going to engage in. So if we get started, maybe my screen's gonna go forward. There we go. Not sure what's going on there. So when it comes to learning, we learn by association. And so association is kind of the ABCs of learning, where we have an antecedent, a behavior, and a consequence. And so what we mean by that is there's the antecedents, which is like the event, the scenario of what is happening. And then there's the behavior of our organism. And then there's some kind of consequence because of that behavior. And so the three major ways that human beings are found to learn about behavior is what we call classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. Today's lesson is actually going to be all about classical conditioning, where we have an association between two stimuli. Then in our next lesson, we'll start talking about operant conditioning, where we learn by rewards and punishments. And then in our final video of this series, we're going to talk about observational learning, where we learn by observing others. But today, all about classical conditioning. So one of the main characters that we need to know for classical conditioning is a man by the name of Ivan Pavlov. So first, Pavlov is not a psychologist. He's actually a German physiologist, and he is studying medicine. And in fact, he's going to go on to win a Nobel Prize in medicine. Yay, him. And one of the things that he's really interested in is digestion. And he wants to know how do human beings digest their food. So what he does is that he's studying digestion in dogs. And he sets up this experiment in which this is going to sound bad, he redirects saliva from the dog's cheeks into a tube because he wants to measure how much saliva they produce at any given time. I know, kind of sad for the dogs. So he started running into a problem though, where his dogs would salivate before there was any kind of eating going on. And he called these psychic secretions. And they actually become the foundation of, in psychology, what we are going to come to know as classical conditioning. The psychologist that takes Pavlov's ideas and applies it to humans and learned human behavior is John B. Watson. And in the 1920s, Watson, as a psychologist, is ushering in a totally new wave of how we're going to study human beings by focusing on behavior, making psychology a much more objectable science, which becomes known as behaviorism, where if I can't study the human brain and what's happening in the mind, because at the time they didn't have the technology to do that, well, what's going on in my mind is a result, or my behavior is a result of what's going on in my mind. And if I can't see what's going on in my mind, but I can see behavior is something objectable, something that I can measure, and thus we have this whole kind of new element of psychology that's going to go on. And so this is where the base of that comes from. So back to Ivan Pavlov. So what Pavlov started to do was that he was giving his dogs food, and the dogs would salivate when they were presented with the food, which, as we come to find out, is actually a really important process of digestion, in that you're not going to be able to properly digest food without saliva, because saliva is going to not only moisten up your mouth and your throat and things like that and make it easier for you to swallow. It's also going to aid in tasting food, and it's also going to help break down the food that you eat. So saliva is, kind of a big deal when it comes to digestion. So he's giving dogs their food and they're going to start salivating. But then he has things that are totally unrelated to eating that starts to make the dogs salivate. And he kind of takes this into a whole other kind of experiment, like, how is this happening? What could I do to make it happen? And so we now have the starting of classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, we have some really specific terminology that sometimes gets students a little bit confused. So let's identify what those parts are. First of all, one of the terms that we're going to see a lot of has to do with a stimulus. And in psychology, when we refer to a stimulus, this is going to be something that an organism could see, hear, taste, touch, or smell. So it's something that you are capable of sensing. So when we see the word stimulus, know that that is something that I can sense, something that I'm seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, or smell. And then we're also going to see the word response. And response is going to refer to behavior. And so when we see the word response, we have to know that it's talking about behavior. And then we have some other terms called conditioning or conditioned and unconditioned. Well, condition is just another fancy word for learn or learning or something that is learned. That is what condition is referring to. And obviously then if something is unconditioned, well then it's something that's not learned, right? It's unlearned. Then we also have something known as neutral. And neutral is going to be something that is, well, it's neutral. It doesn't have any kind of impact or whatever. It's not associated with anything. So now that we got these terms down, let's look at our diagram and what Pavlov is actually doing with his dogs. So he is presenting his dogs with food. Food being something that I can see, taste, touch, or smell. And I suppose here that it's going to be a stimulus. And as a stimulus, as an organism, it's something that I don't need to learn really anything about except that it's food and that, I can consume it and it's going to help me. And it's also probably hopefully really delicious. So he's going to refer to food as being an unconditioned stimulus. So something I can see, hear, taste, touch, or smell, and something that is unlearned. The dogs get food. When the dogs are presented with food, they're going to have what becomes known as an unconditioned response or an unlearned behavior. And in this example, it was salivating. That the dogs didn't need to learn that they have to salivate when they're presented with food, that something that's an unconditioned stimulus is something that is reactive. It is an unlearned kind of behavior that my body just does. Something that is part of my autonomic nervous system, maybe the sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, it's going to depend on the scenario. But this is an unlearned response. So the dogs, given food, unconditioned stimulus, they eat the food, they have the unconditioned response of producing saliva. Woo-hoo. But now Pavlov is going to introduce something that is totally unrelated to eating. And in my diagram, it's a tuning fork, when in fact, in Pavlov's experiments, he actually introduced all kinds of random stuff that has nothing to do with eating. Lights, bells, a music box, okay, a ticking metronome. Like there's all kinds of random stuff that what happens is that Pavlov pairs his food with something that was neutral, like in our diagram here, the tuning fork. And so when the dog is presented with the food, there's also a clanging on the tuning fork, which the dog can hear because it's a stimulus. And then after several pairings of food with the sound of the tuning fork, eventually what's going to happen is that the tuning fork alone is going to make the dogs salivate. When this happens, the tuning fork is now referred to as a conditioned stimulus, which means that something that I can see, hear, taste, touch, or smell, and I have learned is going to create some kind of response. But now this time, the response is learned, and therefore it is now a conditioned response. And so Pavlov goes through several different trials of this experiment with all kinds of different neutral stimuli, in that he could make the dog salivate using all kinds of things that had nothing to do with food. But to get there, he had to pair the food with these neutral stimuli. And that's the basis of classical conditioning. He believed that this was ways that humans as well as animals would have learned in the wild, that when I pair this with this, that there's going to be some kind of automatic bodily consequences. And so that might help protect me, for example, from something that might make me sick, or that it's going to be something that I might be fearful of. And so that this is the basis of classical conditioning. So if we go back to our terminology, as we just mentioned, an unconditioned stimulus, which is sometimes referred to by its abbreviation UCS, is a stimulus that's going to trigger response reflexively and automatically. And then that unconditioned response is the automatic behavior that I did. And so this is something that is reflexive and is unlearned. There's all kinds of examples of things like this. When you turn out the lights, your pupils dilate. Or when you turn them on, then your pupils are going to contract. That's something that is totally unlearned and automatic. Could you then pair something random with turning the lights on and off and make your pupils dilate? You sure could. Could you trigger somebody to salivate with the sound of a bell? You sure could. And one of the clearest examples is when people are fearful and they jump, right? That reflex, that kind of jumping reflex that people do, is one of the most common elements of classical conditioning, where being thrown, like a Nerf gun hitting you, right? The Nerf gun could be an unconditioned stimulus, and you feeling pain or jumping or something like that because you just got shot in the face with a Nerf gun, that would be an unconditioned response. So then we had that neutral stimulus that, by being paired with my unconditioned stimulus, is going to gain power. And as it has gained power, it has now become a conditioned stimulus, a CS. And that through conditioning, it has now gained this power to do so. And now it can create a response. Now, you should note that the conditioned response is not necessarily always exactly the same as the unconditioned response. There's going to be examples in which the unconditioned response maybe is really significant, but the conditioned response is maybe like a lesser form of that. And so they don't have to be the same. In a lot of our classic examples of classical conditioning, they are the same, but that's not always going to be the case. And so what's going to happen is what we see in this diagram here, that we're looking at time and we're looking at the strength of our conditioned response. We're looking at the strength of our learned behavior. That as time goes on and that I'm pairing my conditioned stimulus, or a neutral stimulus, if you want to refer to it at this point, with my unconditioned stimulus, you're going to make the strength of your conditioned response, that behavior, so much more stronger the more times that you do this. However, in many cases, once you take away your unconditioned stimulus and you rely solely on your conditioned stimulus, your behavior is going to start to weaken. And so we refer to this period as extinction, meaning that the behavior is starting to become extinct. The pairing of my conditioned stimulus and my unconditioned stimulus over time, that's referred to as acquisition. the stronger or the more times you have acquisition, the stronger your conditioned response is going to be. But once you take away that unconditioned stimulus and you have just the conditioned stimulus alone, a lot of times you're going to start going through extinction. Now, every once in a while, you might get something called a spontaneous recovery. This might be something where, like, suddenly there's a pairing of conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus again, kind of out of the blue. Then, boom, that conditioned response comes roaring ahead once again. And so that's another example of, how spontaneous recovery might exist. Now, John B. Watson, who took Pavlov's idea and how he had kind of established this in terms of digestion and is now applying it to psychology, is very, very well known for an experiment referred to as Little Albert. This is a picture right here of Little Albert, and Watson is going to do a classical conditioning experiment where this baby, Albert, is previously cool with a little white rat who he's playing with it and it's absolutely fine. And so the little white rat is really something that's neutral. It's not going to elicit any kind of response from little Albert. And then Watson starts clanging on like a metal pipe, like a gong is how it's sometimes referred to. And it's a loud sound that startles and scares little Albert. So that loud sound is going to be an unconditioned stimulus, and the fear that little Albert is going to display to that loud sound is now going to be an unconditioned response. Now, kind of sadly, they did this while Albert is playing with this white rat, and they did it numerous times. And so this white rat, which had originally been neutral, is now going to elicit a fear response. And so the white rat goes from being a neutral stimulus to being a conditioned stimulus. And the conditioned response to the white rat is that Albert becomes really fearful of it. However, it didn't end just there. Watson is going to include all kinds of random things that are similar to the white rat. He introduces a white bunny, a white dog, a fur coat, and Albert, in true form, demonstrates that he is scared now of all of these things. And this displays a concept known as generalization, that when I have a conditioned response to a specific conditioned stimulus, that stimuli that are similar to one another can elicit that same conditioned response. And so, like, yes, Albert is conditioned to fear the white rat, but then he starts to fear all kinds of things that are white and furry. Whereas something that's not white and furry, Albert's not going to demonstrate fear against. And this was known as discrimination, meaning that Albert was able to discriminate between stimuli that were not similar to one another. So until next time, I hope you all have a great day. Thank you for joining me.